Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Amanda Kramer, and I'm the Alumni Engagement Program Manager at the University of Colorado Boulder's Lead School of Business. These are certainly trying times, and here at CU Boulder, we have gathered our world-renowned faculty and alumni to provide frank and timely insights for life during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Today is the sixth of 7 webinars in this final spring COVID-19 related webinar series. To view upcoming webinars, please visit our website at colorado.edu/business/alumni. Click the drop-down arrow and click Attend Online Webinars. For today's webinar, we're excited to have CU Boulder Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Journalism, Dr. Liz Skewes, here presenting Disinformation During a Pandemic, the Politics of COVID-19. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, if you have any questions now or during the presentation that you would like to ask Liz, please send a question through the Q&A interface. We will monitor questions as they are submitted, and Liz will respond to them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder for optimum audio quality, we do have everyone on mute except for myself and our speaker. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please notify us through the chat interface and one of our support specialists will touch base. Lastly, a link to access the webinar recording will be sent to all registrants tomorrow, along with a survey link and supplemental resources from today's presentation. Now, I'm excited to introduce today's speaker. Associate Professor Elizabeth Skewes is the chair of the Department of Journalism. Her research focuses on media, sociology, and news practices, the media's role in electoral politics, and popular culture. She also is working on new research involving media coverage of mass tragedies and the victims of those events. She is the author of Message Control: How News is Made on the Presidential Campaign Trail, as well as the author or co-author of book chapters and journal articles on journalistic norms, values, and practices. She was a working journalist for nearly 20 years, was a reporter for newspapers in West Virginia and Florida, and also worked as a freelance reporter for newspapers in New York and Colorado. Welcome, Liz, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand the webinar controls over to you now.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate your time today. I do want to talk to you about how we think about misinformation, how we think about disinformation, mostly in the context of COVID-19, but it has existed prior to COVID-19. It is just incredibly important in this moment in our history. So a little bit of an introduction for those of you who may not be as steeped in journalism as I am, a little bit of introduction into what we think about the role of journalism in society. And this comes from Kovacs and Rosenstiel, two people who are journalists, longtime journalists themselves, and now media scholars. And they talk about the role of journalism as having a primary obligation to truth and a loyalty to citizens. And what that really means is that more than owners, more than corporations, more than the people that they cover, journalists look at their audiences, look at keeping the public informed as being their primary responsibility. To do this, good journalism should be verified. It shouldn't be just running rumors. And we've got a little bit of that goes on now, mostly due to social media. They need to have independence from the people that they cover. They need to have independence from, again, ownership. This idea of being an independent monitor of power, of looking at people who have political power or economic power or social power and being the watchdog for the average person, providing a place where the public can have a voice. And making important stories relevant. I think, again, too often in contemporary media, we go after clickbait rather than important stories. Journalism, again, good journalism is trying to take stories that are important and make them interesting so that we pay attention. Keeping news comprehensive and proportional, not having 50 stories about Stormy Daniels, for instance. Let's try one. Then going, and this is where we're going to end up today, this idea that citizens, as audience members, as citizens in this country, we have rights and we also have responsibilities. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. One of the other things to understand as grounding material is that news is in trouble. Newspapers hemorrhaging money. They don't get much in terms of ad revenue anymore. Newspaper circulation is low. Audiences are down. The only place where we're seeing an increase in audience share right now is with cable news. You can think about Fox News on cable. You can think about Rachel Maddow's show. You can think about any number of cable operators. Those audiences are up. And that's not necessarily a good thing, because cable news makes money by telling us essentially what we want to hear, by framing news in ways that cater to our political preferences. What that means is that we don't get news that challenges us to think differently, that challenges us to consider other perspectives. It's one of our responsibilities now. So we've seen this increase in polarization, and we see it more greatly on people who are non-political viewers. They tend to become more politicized, but those who have strong opinions turn to those shows, and it just reinforces what they already believe. And we see differences in how news organizations cover stories. Now, this example is a little bit old, but it still holds up. So you might remember the story that ran in May of 2017 when President Trump met with a couple of Russian diplomats, including Ambassador Kislyak. The story, the exact same story in CNN, in MSNBC, and in Fox News was treated very differently. Just the headlines from those stories. CNN, citing the Washington Post, says that Trump shared highly classified information with Russians. MSNBC moves straight to a Democratic congressman who, because of the meeting, is calling to impeach Trump. And on Fox News, liberals melting down and turning violent. You might not think that's the same story, but it was. And that's one of the problems. We're getting news in a very politically tailored way that reinforces our existing beliefs. So what that's led to over time is this decreasing trust in the news media. Now, it's never been really high. This question goes back to 1997. That's the first time that Gallup actually asked the question about how much do you trust the news media. I think if we went back further, if we were going back into the 60s or 70s or even the 1980s, you would have seen higher numbers. You would have probably had news trust. From what I've read in other sources, maybe approaching 70% even, but that was when we had, when I was younger, when we had 3 nightly news stations, and you could pick from ABC or NBC or CBS, but the news was pretty much the same on all of them. You just had somebody different delivering them. And it was much more in the model of reporting what we could verify, what the facts were, and leaving the opinion to the editorial pages of a newspaper. That model has shifted. We saw it shift starting in the early 1990s, which is why I think these numbers are a little low overall. We saw it shift in the start of the 1990s with the Contract for America, with a lot of the hyper-partisanship around Bill Clinton. And so that news trust, we started to see decline. We also saw the rise of cable news channels along this time period as well. We see a low for news trust in the 2016 election cycle, and it really hasn't bounced back at all. Largely, people do not trust the media, which means it's harder for us to believe the information we read. There are reasons for this. So first is, we don't agree really anymore about what the facts are. What is one person's fact is another person's opinion. And we've seen the blurring of this, because if you again go back to the 1960s or the 1970s, even on television, when news stories would run, they'd be straight news. And then if they were going to run opinion, they would label it. You'd get a banner across the bottom of the screen that would say commentary or opinion or something like that. You might remember Shana Alexander, and that kind of point counterpoint thing that they used to do on CBS. We don't do that anymore. And now things that run on news channels aren't labeled. So commentary looks the same as a news program. Comedy news like The Daily Show, looks a lot like a news program. Maybe not right now because Trevor Noah is doing the show from home, but generally speaking, he's in a studio, he's at a news desk. It looks like news. That blurs our ability to distinguish fact from opinion. In fact, in a recent Knight Ridder study or Knight Foundation study, 33% of the country, there were 19,000 people who were interviewed in the survey, and 33% of them said they didn't trust their own ability to distinguish fact from opinion. We also have started to put personal experience, even in legacy media outlets. We've seen more influence of personal stories, of telling an individual story and tugging at heartstrings a little bit rather than reporting the facts. And both because of threats from outside and because of work that is done inside of news organizations, we just don't trust them anymore. So that makes the country ripe for misinformation, for disinformation, and there's a difference between the two. Misinformation is the information that might be put out there that is wrong. It wasn't well vetted, it wasn't checked out well, it wasn't verified. Disinformation is much more propagandistic, much more intentionally trying to persuade audiences to think a certain way. They both contain problems, and they're both a threat, I think, to our system of government and to our ability to be really informed. People know this. So in this same Knight Foundation study, people said yes, that fake news is a serious threat. The photo that you're seeing here is of an image of a fake newspaper that was put out in May of last year to kind of, somebody took the Washington Post template and created this entire fake newspaper and actually distributed it in Washington. And some people, at least for a few moments, believed it. So what we know is that, again, lots of people recognize that fake news is out there. They consider it a real threat. They typically define it as portraying false information as if it were true. That's fake. But it's colored. Our sense of what is real and what is not, our judgment about that is off. So, and we don't recognize it readily. So during the 2016 election, for instance, in the final few months of the election, there were more fake news stories that people shared about. Fake news stories generated about 1.3 million more shares, reactions, likes, comments than actual real news stories. The one that got the most traction in those last few months was a fake news story that said that Pope Francis was endorsing Donald Trump for president. And you think, okay, what harm is done? But the studies that were done shortly after that story came out indicate that people still, even if they knew it was fake, it still left them with a positive feeling about Trump and his endorsements. So it has an impact even when people know it's not real. Some of this is a very direct result of the polarization of the country. And while the polarized media feeds the polarized country, it's a feedback loop. The fact that we are now, this data comes from the Pew Research Center. In 2014, you can see the widening gap between where the average Democrat lands in terms of political ideology and where the average Republican lands. And that divide has been monetized, again, by cable news channels. But it's also leading to increased distrust in media, and that's particularly true among Republicans. So the red line here is the Republicans. As of 2019, only 15% said that they had a great deal or a fair amount of trust and confidence in the media. It's much higher among Democrats. It's so among independents, about 36%. More than any other nation, according to this Reuters study, we have polarized media and a polarized political environment. And all of that colors how we think about media. Years ago, it was in the 1980s, a guy named Albert Gunther did a study on political polarization and biased press and things like that. And what he found was that a lot of the bias that we see in the media is the bias that we bring to the media. So he did this with an experiment. He had Republicans and Democrats read the same news story, word for word, the same news story, same headline, same layout. He had them read this news story, and then he had them fill out a questionnaire afterwards. And the people who were Republicans who read the story basically concluded that this story, while informative, was highly biased against Republicans and in favor of Democrats. Democrats reading the same story concluded that it was highly biased in favor of Republicans and against Democrats. They were each bringing their own lenses to how they read the information, and therefore what they took away from it in terms of media bias had something to do with what they brought to it. He actually repeated that experiment for a labor management issue. Labor found a pro-management bias. Management found a pro-labor bias in the exact same news story, and then repeated it with an issue on religion, with Catholics finding a pro-Protestant bias and Protestants finding a pro-Catholic bias. And again, the exact same news story. It tells us that we have our own filters, and we have to sometimes get out of the way of those filters to really understand what's going on. So one of the other interesting things, and I'm getting to COVID soon, but one of the other interesting things out of this Knight Foundation study is tied to that Albert Gunther study, that we see bias in the press. So lots of people saw bias in this image of the Trump inauguration with visibly fewer people than the Obama inauguration in 2009, which was fairly packed. Over and over again, the people who responded, the Republicans who responded to this Knight Foundation study, said that if a news story is accurate, is factual, is grounded in reality, but concludes something negative about somebody that that person supports, then they consider that to be fake news as well. So that earlier definition of fake news being things that are demonstrably false now shifts, for some people at least, into this, no, if I don't like it, it's false. And that's a much thornier problem for news organizations that are trying to cover politics and trying to cover public health issues with facts. So where does that leave us in terms of COVID? What the World Health Organization is saying is that in addition to being in the middle of a pandemic, we are also in the middle of an infodemic. We are not getting good quality information out to people who need it in order to make decisions about what they're going to do in their lives. They call this an overabundance of information, some accurate, some not. But again, we're not good at telling the difference all the time. And that makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources. Some of this is tied to our own anxiety. And so psychologists will tell you that when there is information overload, this abundance, right, too much, it raises our anxiety levels. And when we're anxious, we then tend to seek out more comfortable news sources. If I'm feeling anxious, I want to be in my yoga pants on the couch. And I don't want a lot that's going to challenge me. What I want is information to kind of wash over me in a gentle way. And so we seek out the sources that are familiar. We seek out the information that is comfortable and that doesn't challenge us. And that continues to contribute to the problem of information quality and a lack of it. One of the other things that can happen when we end up in this total infodemic, as the World Health Organization is calling it, is that there's a lot of information that comes out that becomes politicized, and that that challenges what the science tells us. And so even now we have business leaders, we have political leaders who are not listening to the science and instead falling onto things that serve their base that serve some other need, that are not grounded in what the Centers for Disease Control or the World Health Organization or others might say. And the goal of that often is to shift what we consider to be acceptable. Sociologists talk about this as being the Overton window, and it's just constantly putting information out there that challenges what we think is real to shift the point. And so in the nature of the COVID epidemic, it's to shift the point from saying, when there's a vaccine, you should get it, to, oh, maybe, maybe not. We don't know how deadly this is. And the true answer may be somewhere in between. And when we shift that conversation, we can, again, put ourselves in kind of danger. And there has been a tendency to politicize COVID-19. You've probably seen it. Most recently, you had the governor of North Dakota actually having to tell people to stop mask shaming others in North Dakota who were deciding to wear masks. And he was kind of almost teary as he said, you know, some of them may have a 5-year-old at home who is recovering from cancer, and they're just trying to keep that child healthy. He had to say they're not doing it to represent a political party or a candidate that they support, that they are actually probably trying to do what they can to stay healthy. They're following the advice of science. We've seen just, what was it, yesterday, where President Trump took to Twitter, or in an interview said that Joe Biden was being politically correct by wearing a mask on Memorial Day. It makes it a political issue rather than a public health issue. And if you can shift the nature of the conversation, then you can move it sometimes into an area that might favor you. So all of this ties into how we need to think about social media and how social media contributes to this. Social media, while it has done a lot to connect us in important ways and gets information out very quickly, what tends to happen is that information that is incorrect spreads more deeply, spreads more broadly, and spreads more quickly than information that is real, because it's different. And people go, I can't believe this. And they share it. They retweet it. They post it on their Facebook page with an, oh my God. But part of it is, if it really does seem too unreal to be believable, then it probably isn't believable. And we've got a role to play in not spreading that misinformation. Robots also can accelerate the spread of this misinformation, but the fact is, mostly when misinformation is spread, it's people who are doing it. It's not, a robot someplace over at a troll farm. The issue is, for an average person, for the public, the more something gets repeated, even if it gets repeated with a note that says, this isn't true, the repetition, the familiarity of the information makes it feel true. So even news organizations that might debunk false information help reify it in some ways by restating it. Here's what somebody said. Here's why it's not true. Fact checking can sometimes accelerate the spread of misinformation because we don't always remember all of the details. The reason social media is so impactful is because mostly our guards are down. It's our friends. My Facebook friends told me this, so why wouldn't I believe them? They don't have an agenda. We know better than that, but how it feels and what we know are two different things. We also know that because social media spreads a lot of misinformation and disinformation, a lot of mainstream media outlets are doing their journalistic duty and trying to get at the truth of it. They may be missing other stories as they're chasing down whatever the latest internet rumor is. And again, they can run the risk of reinforcing that false information simply by repeating it several times. So how often we get misinformation is a problem. When it comes to COVID-19, there's a lot of misinformation out there. Social media sites are contributing to it mightily. We've got, for various reasons, sometimes, again, agenda-driven. You can think about the anti-vaccine groups that have been pushing stories that say the virus is a hoax, or that Bill Gates is, trying to promote COVID-19 because he's on the verge of, he and his company are on the verge of developing a vaccine for it, and therefore he'll profit off of it. He's going to make a lot of money off of COVID-19. There are people who are saying, it was caused by 5G cell towers. And in fact, in the United Kingdom, more than 70 cell towers were torn down or torched because people believed that COVID-19 was somehow caused by cell towers, even though there is no scientific evidence to support that. And then there's just a ton of unverified treatments that are being put out there on social media. Drugs you can take, or any number of things. So social media keeps all of that alive, and it's a little like whack-a-mole. Even when something gets debunked, it's going to surface back up someplace else. Oftentimes it's people with political agendas who are doing this. So this story that ran a couple of weeks ago, early May, Twitter, Facebook, at the time, there were about 68,000 deaths due to COVID-19. We just passed 100,000 yesterday. But the CDC, in its reports, had just over 37,000 COVID-19 deaths. Now, in the note on that table, what the CDC acknowledged was this was lagging weeks behind what the real numbers were, because they wait for the death certificates to come in. And so the 68,000 deaths that were being reported by Johns Hopkins and other reliable sources of information wasn't an inflated number. It's just they have different standards for how they're using these numbers. But a website called Just the News picked this up and said, well, doesn't this mean that the mainstream media is inflating the actual number of deaths? Laura Ingraham picked it up, and it ran on Fox News. Brit Hume added more volume to it by saying, yeah, well, some things that are being attributed to COVID are actually somebody's diabetes. They would have died from diabetes anyway, so it's not really a COVID death. So there was a lot of conversation around the inflation of the number of COVID deaths from this CDC report. But the CDC report acknowledged that, again, it was not current data because they have to wait for death certificates. So, but all of that feeds into, and a lot of it came out of social media, Plandemic. You may have seen something about this movie that's apparently coming out this summer. This video, which was an interview with one doctor, largely found to be not a reliable source of information. But based on this interview, the filmmaker put this clip up online, QAnon shared it, then again, it spread further when a doctor who is opposed to vaccinations, who had appeared on Oprah, so she has some celebrity, and an MMA fighter who also is opposed to vaccines, took it and shared it on their Facebook pages. It spread even further. This particular video in this doctor, who has been, again, largely found to be not very credible, was claiming that flu vaccines increase your chances of getting COVID-19, that if you've ever had a flu vaccine, you've been injected with COVID-19 or coronaviruses. And then she said that wearing masks actually increases your chances of getting the virus because you're breathing your own air. All of this is not backed by any science. And so the movie, however, this clip spread. It spread quickly. You can see on this graph that came from the New York Times that, other stories that were breaking at the same time were getting much less traction than Plandemic close to 2.5 million interactions, shares, and likes, and things like that. More than 8 million people saw this video in the roughly week that it was up. It did get removed by Facebook, by YouTube, Vimeo, and a few other places because it was so inaccurate. And that is one of the areas where YouTube and Facebook at least have said that for COVID-19 information that is not verified, they will remove the content. So it's created some issues. So where do you look for how do you spot false information? This is kind of where we come in. Some things that you can do, you can look for grammatical errors. You can look to see if other news organizations are saying the same thing. And if they are, then great. And if they're not, you may want to question that source. Is the news story providing good sources, solid sources, hyperlinks that take you to additional information? And also look at the URL. I put this little story up here because it's a fake news story that ran in the 2016 election cycle. The guy who created it made a page that looked very much like ABC News, put it at a site called abcnews.com.co. And when the actual ABC URL is different, and also the actual ABC News logo is just a little different, but it's very similar. And if you're not really paying attention, you can get caught by this. There are these sites that you can go to. Who has a Mythbuster sites? It's a Snopes for COVID information. You can go there and you can find out what's being said and whether it's true or not. But they're trying to really handle debunking what some people are saying about COVID-19 and about the treatment and about the precautions that we need to take. FEMA has a rumor control center, CDC does, and so does the US Department of Defense. These are all really reliable sources. And then we have to stop sharing stuff. If you don't think something is true, if you just think it's too weird, too wild, again, verify it. If it's not true, don't reinforce it by sharing it. Don't link to it, just ignore it. Hopefully it will go away. We also need to realize that what we might get in social media, a tweet, a short video clip, a TikTok, or whatever, all of the issues around COVID-19, issues around our political system are complex, and trying to handle them in a 240 character tweet or a 30-second TikTok, it doesn't happen. We have to recognize that we do have our own filter bubbles, our own biases, and be willing to challenge ourselves. So I call it reading across the aisle. There's actually an app you can get to that helps you do this. Read a lot of different news sources and recognize that if something challenges you, maybe you should give it some thought rather than just rejecting it. And again, my pitch, consider paying for news. Good quality news, somebody's got to produce it. And if we're not willing to pay for news, if we only get what we get for free, then our news quality suffers and our own ability to be informed suffers. So lastly, you can go through this, what they call in-vein process, to think about whether you're getting quality news. Does the story have independent sources? Does it have multiple sources? Is the information verifiable? Are the sources authoritative? Do they have a reason to be saying what they're saying? Are they experts? And are they named? Because when people are relying on anonymous sources, it's about as useful as anonymous comments at the end of a news story. So those are all things that we can do as citizens until the news catches up with us and gets a little less polarized.
Great. Thank you, Liz, for that information. Now we will be moving into Q&A. Please feel free to submit your question through the Q&A interface. I see we already have quite a few questions streaming in. We'll try to get to as many as we can. The first question comes from Caitlin. Could you share tips on how to objectively talk about the current issue?
Yeah, so one of the things that we can do is ground our own conversations in information. Be sure you know what you're talking about. If you're going to be talking to folks, and especially if you're trying to convince people who might disagree with you, Be sure that your information is well-grounded and that you can tell them where they can go to verify what you're telling them. But it's also really important in conversations with people, and especially those who might disagree with you, to be a very good listener, to figure out, to listen to why they ask questions. Why do you believe what you believe? Where did you get your information? Not in a accusatory way, in a way that really does seek to understand and build some bridges. If we can start to do that as citizens, then again, I think we can start to see maybe some of that mirrored in our media coverage.
Okay, thank you for that. Next, we have a question from Jay. He asks, why doesn't Facebook pull political ads news if they claim to not be contributing to disinformation?
For a couple of reasons. One is we have a long-standing tradition and Supreme Court rulings that tell us that political speech, this goes back to the New York Times versus Sullivan case from the 1960s, 1964, I believe, but that political speech, because it contributes to public discourse, should not be impinged. So, and political advertising is a form of political speech. One of the other things, though, that comes in and is a key factor in this, and some of you may have seen the news stories, President Trump is threatening an executive order that would change the nature of internet service providers and organizations like Twitter and Facebook. They're now protected under Section 230 they can put stuff out there. And as long as they are simply the delivery mechanism for information, then they're not responsible for the information that is posted there. But once they step in and start to pull things and start to edit content, then they become editors. And then libel laws and things like that start to apply to them in ways that they don't right now. They have a lot of protection from being sued for libel under Section 230.
Okay, thank you for that. Next, we have a question from Daniel. He said, what's the difference, or is there a difference, between satire and fake news?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So fake news, if you go back to that Hillary Clinton story that I was showing you, the story that somebody was being paid $3,500 to protest at a Trump rally. That story was created by a guy named Paul Horner and run on his website, his fake ABC News website, and intended to mislead. Satire is something like The Daily Show, where they take current events and put a satirical spin on it. Satire is intended to make fun of events of the day. Fake news is intended to mislead you about what the real events of the day are and what the facts are.
Okay, thank you. Next, we've gotten this question several times. Casey and Susan most recently have asked, what major specific news providers would you consider to be the least biased / most reliable? If we think about TV and newspaper, they're wondering.
So, and I know some of you are going to say, but those are so biased. But I tend to lean more heavily on kind of the network news, the ABC, NBC, CBS nightly news as national news organizations, because I do think because they're still trying to reach a general audience, a broad audience, they try to keep it more centered. I think the New York Times still tries to, it might lean a little on the left. There's a media bias chart out that it's put out by Ad Fontes Media. If you just type in media bias chart in a Google search or something, you can get to it pretty quickly. But what it does is show both on a left-right spectrum and also on a news quality spectrum where news organizations tend to fall. And you can debate whether they've landed the Hill in the right spot or the New York Times or the Associated Press or whatever. But the point is, I think it's, for me, one of the interesting things I like about that chart is that instead of being concerned about whether I'm reading news from the left or the right, how about I actually elevate the quality of the information? And so the news organizations that appear at the top of the chart are those that at least that try to follow good journalistic practices of original reporting with multiple sources, with verifiable information and links and all of that. And they might have a tilt one way or the other, but it's not going to be significant. It's when you get down to the lower quality news organizations that you start to see them falling to the very far ends of the political spectrum. And so you can think about InfoWars, for instance, as being something that was really very far right, or Daily Cost, which is pushing farther and farther to the left, and these sort of online-only venues that mostly try to persuade rather than inform.
Okay, thank you for that. John and a couple of others ask, can you provide examples of across the aisle apps that you referenced?
Oh, yeah, the one that I have actually on my phone it's literally called Read Across the Aisle. And I have an iPhone, so I know it's made for iPhone. The other thing that I recommend to people is and it's fairly inexpensive, there's an app that you can download for your web browser, or a widget or whatever, called NewsGuard. I think it's $1 or $2 a month to subscribe to it. But when you do then a search in your search engine for information, it's going to put a little icon next to information. And if it's green, then that means it's from a pretty reliable source. And if it's red, it means it can go where you want to go. But that information source that you're going to has a history of trading in misinformation and disinformation. So NewsGuard is one. There's another one called Trusted News that you can check out. Those are the ones I know the most about.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Next, we have a question from Kim. She says, in the case of the pandemic, what is the impact of the unknown? There are so many things about the virus we haven't learned yet. Does this create a void? And then what?
It does create a void, actually. And that place where we don't have information, where we have questions that we can't answer, oftentimes we'll try to fill that with something. And so we'll go to somebody who will tell us something that just sounds really good, or that comports with our existing belief system, because we hate living in uncertainty. And so it creates a void where misinformation can come in and fill that space. Again, one of the things that we have to do as citizens, and we don't know everything about COVID yet. There's a lot we don't know. We've got to be a little more willing to accept the fact that we don't know and that we can't know just yet. Answers will come. And until then, we just have to do the best we can to try and stay healthy and keep those around us healthy.
Okay, thank you for that. Next, we have a question from Delara. She asks, any questioning of policy leads to association with the conservative movement. Are there more than two camps?
Oh, yeah. One of my nits, if you will, or the things that I don't like about media coverage is too often when there is an issue, news organizations will find the person who's, really loud in favor of it and really loud opposed to it, and get those two people and talk to them, or sometimes put them on a split screen and have them shout at each other for a few minutes. And somehow we're supposed to feel like that informs us. But that doesn't represent most of us. On a lot of the big issues of the day, we are somewhere in the middle. Of the people I've talked to, there is nobody who is saying, because of COVID-19, we should be completely shut down. I'm never leaving my home again, and nobody else should either. And I'm just going to have everything delivered. But although I don't know who's going to deliver that if nobody leaves home. There's also, I haven't talked to too many people who are just, let's not worry about it. If we get it, we get it. I've seen a few of those people interviewed on television. Most of us fall somewhere in the middle. How can we be responsible? How can we take care of ourselves? And how can we try to get back to work and life and school and the things that we do that are how we advance ourselves and our civilization? Most of us fall in the middle. So the fact that the media coverage tends to lean on the extremes, I think, misrepresents where most of the public is.
Okay, great, thank you. We are moving into our final 3 questions here. The first question comes from Greg. He said, Liz, what is your opinion on the future credibility of the media in general?
I'm an optimist. I think there are moments like this where news will step up and do a good job and provide most people, not all, because not everybody will believe it, but will provide most people with solid and credible information. And that, yeah, I think people will learn to rely on the media more. In fact, there's early data that shows that people have started turning to more legacy media organizations in this moment, and that even now that things are opening back up and it doesn't feel quite the highest level of anxiety that we were at a few weeks ago, they're sticking with news organizations, and news organizations that do try to do good work. News organizations that are at the top of that media bias chart. So I think I'm optimistic that this pendulum is going to swing back. It's going to take some time though, because we've spent a long time tilting towards polarized information and relying a little too much on opinion makers rather than news.
Okay, thank you. On to our final 2 questions. The second to last question here comes from Michael. He says, what are some things that you see as being underreported in current coverage of the pandemic?
Most recently, I think we've lost sight of the science. And I don't know if that's because we're not having the press briefings with Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx right now. I think we're seeing a lot of stories about the impact on people, a lot of stories that are trying to give us hope about people surviving the virus, getting home from hospitals. There was one the other night about, a baby that was born prematurely to a mother who was in a coma because she had COVID, and all of that is intended to make us feel good. So I think I feel like we're lacking in the more complex information, and the information that we were getting initially that said we're probably still at least 6 months and maybe a year away from a vaccine that can, reliably be shipped out and put into effect. I think we're not getting as much of that information anymore.
Okay. Thank you. And then our final question today comes from Mark. He wonders, how do the current politics compare to other times of crisis?
We are in a time now, and it's partly because of social media and it's partly because of polarization of our political system, where we don't have a national come together moment about this. Instead, the issue of COVID became almost immediately polarized. And again, back to the North Dakota governor, whether you wear a mask or not is a political statement, not a public health concern. If you go back to, say, 9/11, which was a moment of great national crisis, we came together as a country. Bush's approval ratings shot through the roof. We mourned as a country, and we agreed on certain basic principles as a country. And then as time shifted, we went back kind of to our own camps about how we felt about privacy rights and how we felt about police being able to investigate, about lots of different issues. But we had a time where we came together, and we haven't had that in this moment. And I think that may be a part of, for me at least, the tragic feeling about all of this, because in moments of crisis, that's when we need to come together and kind of have a shared set of values.
Great. Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining us for today's presentation, and a special thank you again to Liz for this great information. As a reminder, all webinar attendees will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of this presentation. To view upcoming webinars as well as previous recordings, please visit our website at colorado.edu/business/alumni. We hope that you will join us for our final webinar in this series, which is next Friday, June 5th, as CU Boulder Associate Professor of Law, Craig Conniff, addresses legal ramifications of the nation's response to the pandemic. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day and week ahead, and go Buffs!